Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are going to be working on this. I'm going to show you how I finished this with monster clay. Let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the armature. You can see I have a aluminum wire sculpture attached to a pipe. That's a good way of starting your sculptures. And since I'm using oil-based clay, I can move around the armature really well and add clay on top. One of the things I'm using is aluminum foil, and aluminum foil is going to be my mass in, so I don't have to use as much clay because oil-based clay is very expensive. It's not cheap like water-based stuff. But first I'm starting with some leftover J-Mac clay. I really like J-Mac clay. It resembles probably the closest thing to water-based clay as I have, but I don't think it's really good for this type of sculpture. So I am eventually going to add my monster clay medium that I think works pretty well on top of this. One of the techniques I've found for oil-based sculpture is that if you just put in your clay in the microwave for 2 minutes or so, it's going to warm up the clay enough that it can resemble almost the consistency of a really nice water-based clay, that you can be a little bit more virtuoso with the clay, a little bit more painterly. But it quickly turns into that robotic style. If you want your sculpture to look heroic and really superhero-like, you want to have more heads. You essentially make his head a little bit smaller and the body becomes a lot bigger. One thing that I wanted is to have detachable arms, because what I want to do is perhaps I want to make a mold of the sculpture later on, so I'll probably add a little bit of an aluminum wire that I can remove easily. At this point you see the different clay that I'm adding on top. The monster clay is surprisingly good, and what I like about it is that it's got a little bit more wax to it. It doesn't stick to your hands as much as the J-Mac clay or the Chavant clay, but it's a little bit harder to apply it fluidly. So put it in the microwave for 1 to 3 minutes, and it's going to help that out quite a bit. When you use monster clay, you do have to rely on metal tools quite a bit, and I found that the working with this sort of clay is very similar to working with wax clay. That is, you heat up the tools. I have these little mini torches. You can heat it up and touch the clay with your metal tool. It'll kind of melt a little bit. It gives it a different sort of style. You can really see the difference between the J-Mac clay and the monster clay. And when you rake over the J-Mac clay, it leaves a little bit of a residue that I don't like, but I have done some really decent sculptures with the J-Mac. If you look at my Dead Bird series, they were all on J-Mac clay, and I think that blends it well for something a little bit more fluid. So if you're trying to get away from the stiffness that monster clay gives you, give J-Mac clay a try, and it's a lot cheaper than monster clay. You know, at this point I'm thinking about the pose. What should I have them do? There are so many things I can have them do that it's almost, you have to force yourself to pick a pose. Boots are going to be very individual, and one of the things I've found is that there are great references for boots from motorcycle makers. So for the pose, I decided an open hand. It almost resembles my ape holding a human skull. I was thinking about adding the skull of the Joker, but with a big smile on the actual skull. But I decided to decapitate the Joker's head and put the Joker in there. I could still change it. That's the beauty. This little mini torch helps out quite a bit. Keeps my tools nice and warm. And this is the crochet I have on Patreon for free. You can download it. I'm using it as reference for the muscles. And I found that having some anatomy reference up in front of you helps quite a bit. It helps more than having to pull up your laptop and look at reference. In hindsight, I should have used a wire mesh, but these little aluminum strings do help out quite a bit. so the wires just kind of stick out from the body, and I connect them using just water clay. Eventually I cut another chunk of cereal box to add to that right foot. I decided to cut the leg at the hip just so I can give it a different pose. I mean, this is the beauty of oil-based clay. You can do all sorts of stuff like this. And you don't have to worry about the structure underneath. You just simply move it. So I cut it at the knee as well because I wanted to have a different bend to the legs. And now I'm just going to be pushing in the wire and then move my cereal box so it looks like he's taking a step on something. Before I join it together, I'm just going to heat up the clay. I use some aluminum foil to add a little bit of mass to the cape. I keep an oil radiator running, and this keeps my oil clay nice and warm but not hot. Adding a little bit more of a string to connect the cape a little bit more. So this way it looks like there's some wind. One of the things I don't like about oil clay is that you rely a lot on scraping tools. Scraping tools take a little bit longer to make something than water type of tools because the water clay is just so much softer and you can work on it very quickly. But oil-based clay, there's a little bit of a delayed gratification to it because I do like this clay quite a bit, and the medium gives you a good flexibility. At this point, I am concentrating with these wire tools and making a nice straight edge. If you make this a little bit warmer, it's easier to scrape and blend the edges. But even the little scraping tools, I do like it because it gives it a more human quality as opposed to the robotic quality that oil-based clay forces you on. And so at this point, I'm going to be sculpting the Joker face, and there's so much that goes into the Joker face. I could have made any style of Joker. I went with a cartoony style, but I will be probably updating this on my Patreon page, so I'll be like replacing it with perhaps something else. Now I want to concentrate a little bit on the face of Batman. That is the highlight of the piece, and I want it to kind of drift off a little bit from his face. And I also want it to be a standalone, so I will be casting the upper part separately in silicone. So I removed the arms because I wanted to work on them separately, and the easiest ways to attach them again is just simply to heat up the clay and just use the clay as some sort of glue. I also bought a heat gun. So the heat gun, it's got two settings, high and low. On high, it will blend everything together, but also if you overuse it, it'll turn it into a liquid. So you have to be very careful. I find that just hitting it a little bit with the heat gun is good enough for blending in the surface. So at this point, I'm going to heat up the arm. I am ready to put it back. I did some details underneath where it was a little bit harder to reach. And that's one of the beauties really of oil-based clays, that you can do this. It's a little bit harder with water-based clay because you want them to dry all at the same rate. But with this, you don't have to worry about that. So just kind of blend the seams together. If you remember where the seams are, that's where I'm going to be cutting the Batman after I scan it to do a silicone mold. But at this point, you just kind of blend it together, and the oil-based clay just acts as a glue. The aluminum wire just kind of holds it together. Same thing with the hands, like they are very hard, but I want them to look a little bit more naturalistic as I am posing the decapitated head of the Joker. And I'll just add some details to the gloves. He is wearing gloves, so I don't have to worry too much about the detail of the fingers. I want to blend the abs a little bit, just hitting it with the gun. You see it turns it into a fine mush. You can't go overkill. I do like these metal tools for working with this, but I find that with monster clay, you have to work pretty small. It's too much to work on something this big, I find. Most of the sculptors I see online, they work much smaller. And I think this sort of monster clay aids in working small. But if you have to work large, you might want to consider something else. Of course, one of the things is that it's expensive. It's a very expensive type of clay. It's understood why. It's a really beautiful clay to use. It's waxy, it doesn't stick to your fingers, and it gives you good results. A little robotic, but very good results. So at this point, I decided to look at motorcycle boots. I couldn't find a lot of reference for Batman just by looking at Batman stuff because I need to have different views, and every single Batman is wearing different gloves. So different boots, I should say. So motorcycle boots, I decided to go with them because they look pretty darn cool. Especially the adventure style of boots. They look like something that Batman would use. So I'm adding a few more details to the boots. Some straps to tighten it. I don't have to add a lot of detail. I think some people do spend quite a bit on the detail of these things. I'm not that worried about it. I don't want it to look like a 3D model. So even by making just an abstract style of boot, when you take a step back from the sculpture, it should all make sense. After melting the mask and the head, I just go over it with this metal tool. It's like a dental tool, but I love the flatness that it gives you. It lets you concentrate on the geometry as opposed to very minute details. So I want to create a little bit of a crease in the chest, and then I am going to work on the tool belt. Depending on which Batman you use, you might have a buckle in the front, or you might have a bat logo. I thought the bat logo was a little bit overkill because we already have a Batman logo in his chest. We don't need more logos. I'm going to hit it really quick with a heat gun. You can see it melts the edges really nicely. Now let's add some details to the eagle. And at this point, you can start to figure out what you want in the eagle. There's so much to it. And I was thinking about adding a gargoyle instead, and I might still do it. There's also a sculpture I did a while ago of a keystone of a lion. I was considering putting that in there as well. So at the back of the head, I wanted to add the occipital bone of the human skull. So it makes it look like Batman's wearing a little bit thinner of cape and mask. It is interesting to see the difference of light. So when you see it in natural daylight like this, it looks a lot cooler. At least I think so. But as a sculptor, you should light your model in very different points of view because you want to be able to see if there's mistakes if you point a light straight up or a light straight down or sideways. So for this sculpture, I used 2 entire chunks of this monster clay. So it's kind of expensive. I sculpted the pouches separately, and now I'm going to melt this together and I'm going to add it. Basically, heating up the 2 halves will create glue. So you don't have to worry too much about it joining. So one thing that I did struggle with was what to put in his hand. And the cool thing is, because I do plan on scanning this in and putting it on Thingiverse and Patreon, and what I can do is I can remove this head, which is the Joker's head. Not exactly sure why I decided that a decapitation was a good idea, but what I can do is remove it, add something else, and then add an update on Patreon. You can download it, put it on his hand. So it'll be very interesting to have. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. It took me a really long time to create the sculpture, and I plan on spending a whole lot more time scanning and fixing the sculpture up. So stay tuned for that. I'll probably put some videos up on the process, but I really appreciate you guys watching, and thank you to all my Patreon subscribers. I really appreciate the additional support, and make sure you hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next sculpture. Thanks for watching.